In this episode, we see dolphins, Sheila models a new hat, I attract flies, and we drive into the tropics. In this week's show, we continue our drive north to Monkey Mere in Shark Bay, Carnarvon, and then on into the tropics with Coral Bay and Exmouth. The first stop after leaving Kalbarri behind us was the resort of Monkey Mere on Shark Bay. Formed a mere 6,000 years ago when sea levels rose, Shark Bay is the size of Wales, and its very shallow southern arm, called Hamlin Pool, is a natural salt trap. That means it has perfect conditions for more stromatolites, and it hosts the biggest colony on the planet. In my enthusiasm, I've produced a 3-hour spectacular featuring my blue Proterozoic friends, but my editor-in-chief says I'm not allowed to show it now, and that I have to save it for what she euphemistically calls another time. So, watch out for our forthcoming Matilda and the Barefoot Medic Stromatolite Christmas special, a great stocking filler for all the family. We stayed at Monkey Mere Resort, but had a wonderful day in Denham, population 750 and Australia's most westerly town.
So it's Friday morning and we arrived in Monkey Mere last night in our campsite, and today we decided to come and explore the little town of Denham. And oh my goodness, we've just had a couple of hours of exploring the history of Denham, which is amazing. Denham itself is a beautiful little town on Shark Bay. It's absolutely stunning. There's not many people here at the moment, but enough to make it feel delightful without feeling overbooked or too touristy. So most of the last few hours we spent in the Discovery Centre, which if you ever come here you must go to. It's absolutely fabulous. And we've been learning about the various shipwrecks that have occurred. I'm standing just next to the anchor here, which belonged to the Gudrun, which was a 3-masted wooden bark which was said to be sabotaged by its ship's carpenter and sunk eventually. Who knows why the carpenter decided that he wanted to scuttle this boat, but he'd had a couple of attempts. He was arrested on charges of boring holes into the hull of the ship, but apparently because he wasn't an Australian citizen, nothing could be done, and so he was allowed back on the ship and off he went, only to continue to make holes in the hull of the ship, which ultimately meant that the captain had to seek help in Shark Bay, where the ship was deemed to be beyond repair. So here is one of its anchors here, which was kept from the wreck. The main event, though, I think, was the story of HMS Sydney 2 and its fatal encounter with the German ship, the Cormoran. This happened in 1941. The Cormoran was very lucky in that it managed to scuttle to fire and to cause fatal damage to HMS Sydney within the first 5 minutes of the battle. In fact, within the first 30 seconds, I think the die was cast. Ultimately, the German captain did decide to abandon the Cormoran, so there are 2 shipwrecks over in that direction that were lost for 68 years. Recently rediscovered some years ago. You can't go there because it's still being subject to a lot of research and so on. The exhibition here is excellent, very sad, because of course this has happened within relatively recent memory. We also learnt about science, and we revisited our old friends the stromatolites as well, much to our delight. There is yet another exhibition on stromatolites here, which is all done extremely well. And we've also discovered a new favourite, because Denham is one of the few towns where there are buildings built out of shells. So these bricks are made of lots of compressed tiny little shells, and they are, because of the circumstances, the geography of Shark Bay, in particular Hamelin Pool, these little shells are not predated upon, and so they're able to build up in such big numbers that when they die, the shells are compressed down and can form a sort of glued together rock-like substance which has been able to be carved into bricks. And there is a restaurant in town which is said to be built exclusively out of those bricks. So all in all, a really interesting afternoon spent here in the rather delightful town of Denham, and we had great coffee as well.
Meanwhile, back at Monkey Mere,
So we're at Monkey Mere, and this is really the star of the show. Apart from the beautiful environment, is the dolphins that we came down to see this morning. They are absolutely amazing. They come in so close. We were really lucky today, apparently, because we saw 15 dolphins that came visiting, and there was an excellent presentation by two of the staff here, and then some of the volunteers, proper volunteers, not just people out of the audience, fed them, and they're just glorious, absolutely beautiful creatures. There's also a couple of big turtles that live under the jetty. So it's just superb, absolutely glorious here. I'm hoping to see some dolphins later as well.
Just on the top. So that actually happened with, I believe, was it like it's not the big one, so it's not a house. It's likely that the scientists are
Monkey Mere was well worth a visit, and for all the camping wonks who might be interested in staying, this place scores a full 5 out of 5. Great pictures, great amenities, a bar and restaurant with a fantastic buzz, and all at a decent price. Beware though, you must book in advance. And then we were on the road again, but stopped off at Shell Beach.
We are leaving Monkey Mere today, and we've just stopped at Shell Beach, which is this enormous stretch of shells. Some of these shells go down 9 meters deep. Now, these shells are all a particular type of cockle shell. They can thrive here because of the hypersalinity. Shell Beach actually borders Hamelin Pool, which we've previously talked about because of the stromatolites there. I think I can take this off just for the moment because the flies don't like the wind. These shells, so they're not predated on, these little cockles, and so when they die, the shells just accumulate in great mounds, and over time they break down into calcite, and they sort of end up being glued together. They're partly dissolved, and the calcite forms blocks, and the blocks are, because they don't completely break down, you can still see some forms of shell and sometimes animal bones held within them that are harder than the calcite itself. This is an amazing place. It's all very bleached and it feels a bit desert-like. It's windy today just because it's windy today, and we're just going to have a walk right down to the seashore, and you're specifically forbidden from removing any shells from here, so we won't be doing that, but we'll go down and have a look and see what else we can find.
Then we arrived at Carnarvon. And here we are in sunny Carnarvon. We've had a lovely 2 or 3 days in Monkey Mere and on the Peron Peninsula, and the whole of the Shark Bay environment is it's just incredible, because it effectively is a very large nature sanctuary. Drone flying is not allowed, so there's no drone footage from there, but we hope that what we've got gives a good impression. And now we've arrived in Carnarvon, population 5,000, which is pretty big for this neck of the woods, and is a bit of a hub for the Gascoyne River region. And we're very much looking forward to going. We've just got a day here. We're going to visit a museum this morning out near the old jetty, and then this afternoon we are visiting Carnarvon's Space Museum. There was, in fact, a NASA tracking station installed here in the 1950s, and I think was in use through until the maybe even the late 70s. And obviously, the little boy in me is pretty excited about going and having a look around that. So bring it on. And here we are at the 1 Mile Jetty Museum. It's actually closed because it's a Monday, and as we're moving on tomorrow, this is our only opportunity to be here. But there's loads of old equipment lying around outside with lots of information boards, and so the fact that it's shut hasn't really dampened our enjoyment or our interest.
Carnarvon has been an agricultural centre since the 1890s, and the museum has loads of exhibits from the early years. Of course, they needed a way of getting the produce to market, so built a jetty a mile out into the deep water so ships could dock. It remained operational for over a century, but in 2021 it was irreparably damaged by tropical cyclone Soroya.
Now, I just have to tell you about this thing. This steam engine behind me here was built in 1908 in Lincoln, in England, by a company called Roby and Sons, and was transported all the way out here and began work in Carnarvon in 1909. This magnificent piece of engineering is rated as producing 3 horsepower. It operates apparently at a pressure of 100 psi with a red danger line of 120 psi. So an absolute tiddler of a steam engine, and all of that effort to produce 3 horsepower. And behind me we have the latest addition to the museum's inventory, which is not quite as old as the steam engine from Lincoln. The Coffee Pot Express for all of your refreshment needs.
So I'm just going to talk to you about the statue that's up on that little hill over there. Hopefully Mark can pan round so you can see that. We're not going up there because the flies are pretty bad today. As a little aside, this is not a permanent situation. The flies are particularly bad in the autumn and winter when there's been the first rains, and then there's sunshine again after the rain. So we've happened to have struck this part of the southwest coast at a bad time for flies. They're fine the rest of the time, but today I've been up to the statue and they're pretty bad there, so I'm not going back up there to talk to you about this. But this statue is called the Don't Look at the Islands, and it represents a young Aboriginal girl, Indigenous girl, with her little brother, and the girl has got one hand over her eyes and she's pointing out at the islands in Shark Bay known as Dore and Bernier Islands. Now, back in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, those islands were used as essentially some sort of infectious disease isolation units. One island had the women and one island housed the men, and people with things, when they were considered to have leprosy or venereal diseases, were obviously unwillingly transported by ship the 56 kilometres to those 2 islands. Now, a lot of those Indigenous people, they came from all over the area. Many of them had never seen the sea, and so the waves crashing in on the beach would be utterly terrifying for them. They were torn away from their families. Usually it was the adults, so children were left totally uncared for. And this statue has been created, it was only placed in 2019 in collaboration with the Indigenous community as a means of making progress towards healing for the Indigenous community from this terrible wrong that was inflicted upon them back in the early 20th century. It's very poignant.
Then it was time for the Carnarvon Space Museum. It's housed in the buildings once used by NASA in support of the Gemini and Apollo programs, and some of the original equipment and computers are on display, with lots of technical information and personal stories from the golden age of space exploration. There's nothing earth-shattering here, but it's a great way to spend a couple of hours on what is essentially a village of 5,000 people running a deep space tracking facility. Gives an insight into some of the weird contrasts that we've stumbled across in the northwest. And so to our camping corner. We stayed at the Outback Oasis Caravan Park, and it was absolutely fine for a short stay. The pitch was good and it was quiet, but the amenities were really tired and the location wasn't great. Fine for a couple of nights, but probably not much longer. And then it was on into the deep northwest. As we drove up to Coral Bay, we were struck by the change in the landscape from arid desert covered in acacia scrub to broad grassland. And here is Matilda waiting patiently before we finally drove over the Tropic of Capricorn and on to Coral Bay. The permanent population of Coral Bay is just 250, but holidaymakers swell that many-fold. We had a wonderful couple of days here and would be back like a shot. The waters are clear, blue and warm. There are beaches around that are literally deserted, and Bill's Restaurant and Bar does a pretty good supper and a decent beer. You soon find that everything in these parts has Ningaloo in the name. That's because of the Ningaloo Reef, the longest fringe reef in the world. But we stayed at the Ningaloo Coral Bay Bayview Caravan Park, which was great. The amenities were a bit tired, but clean, and otherwise we gave it top marks. And then it was on to Exmouth.
So we're standing here at the Flaming Head Lighthouse, which is probably close to being the most northwesterly point on the West Australian mainland, which therefore makes it on the Australian mainland as well. And it's actually a fascinating place because it's got quite a lot of not very well known military history. So the lighthouse itself was built in 1912, it was subsequently abandoned some years later and replaced by a much more modern structure, not requiring a lighthouse keeper or anything along those lines. There's an anchor over to my left, which is from a ship that went down on the far coast over there. We've just been out on a glass-bottom boat to have a look at the Ningaloo Reef, which is over to my left, the largest fringing reef in the world, and it's all absolutely fascinating.
Flaming Head is the northwesternmost point of the continent. Sail 1,500 kilometres south and you get to Cape Lewin in the bottom left-hand corner. 3,000 kilometres to the northeast and you reach Darwin. Now this peninsula is arid, hypersaline and hosts an average of 3 tropical cyclones a year. Not surprisingly, there was a mere handful of European settlers right up until the 1940s.
It was then that the Allies decided to locate a submarine refuelling base here. Its construction was called Operation Potshot, but the servicemen were mainly housed in tents, and after the war the area was once again abandoned. Nikita Khrushchev is probably the reason for the existence of Exmouth, because following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US Navy realised it couldn't communicate with its nuclear submarines if they were in the Indian Ocean. So, in 1963, they constructed the very low frequency array of masts that we see here. Incidentally, the tallest mast is 398 metres tall, taller than the Empire State Building. Anyway, Exmouth was built as a community to house the families of US and Australian service people, and was officially opened in 1967. The US left in the 1990s, but the military facilities here are still operated by Australia and remain integral to US submarine communications.
And there we have it, we've made it to Exmouth. We've had a couple of fantastic days here actually. So good that we haven't actually done any filming, and so we've left all the filming till the end, when actually we've got quite a lot of cloud and it's pretty windy, and so this isn't really giving a very good impression of the weather that we've had while we've been here. We've just been to the Discovery Centre, which is really well worth a visit, and it's got a lot about the history and the geology and the ecology of the area. Just off the coast here there's Ningaloo Reef, which is apparently the longest fringe reef in the world, runs for hundreds of kilometres and is maybe 3 kilometres out from the coast right the way along. So that's been fascinating. We went out on a boat there, so we've got some footage from that which we'll show you as well. It's also been interesting to find out why so many of the geographical features up the west coast of Australia have Dutch names, and that is basically because when the Dutch booted the Portuguese out of the East Indies, they realised that it was far quicker to get to their new colonies by coming around Africa but then heading south into the Southern Ocean and picking up the Roaring Forties, scooting across and then coming up the west coast of Australia, than going the other way around the north of the Indian Ocean. And so they've mapped out the west coast of Australia pretty well, hence all of the Dutch names. We've had a lovely time here. It's amazing to think that they were hit by a Category 4 tropical cyclone just 6 weeks ago. You can see some signs of damage, but for the most part they've done an amazing job in getting the place back on its feet, and it's done them real credit. That's the end of this week's show. Tomorrow we head inland, and we will be spending the whole of next week at the Karijini National Park, and we hope that you can join us for that, so that we can show you all that has to offer. Until then, take care.